Hello, Malcolm Brady of Dublin City University Business School here with you again today. We're going to talk about business ethics. So we're back to, in a sense, where we started. We started with decision making in a general sense, and we're ending now with business decisions, but looking at them from an ethical point of view. Okay, so that's what we'll be covering in the next 10, 15 minutes or so. So first of all, you can see in the slide here that there's a definition of ethics, the moral principles that govern a person's behavior or the conducting of an activity. So we're looking here at moral values, moral principles, things one ought to do or things one should do. Business ethics then is often defined as the way the company conducts its business. And you can remember that's very close to the definition of culture, broadly speaking, the way we do things around here. So ethics and culture very much go together. The culture often embodies the ethics of the organization. So business ethics themselves, as I mentioned, they can be defined as a code of conduct or a credo. So they can be written down as a set of rules. Johnson & Johnson are often given as their credo is often given as an example of a good code of ethics. So have a look at that if you wish. So do a search on Johnson & Johnson's credo. Obviously, ethics are transmitted through role models, particularly leaders in the example given by leaders. It's one of the major roles of leaders is to give example and to sort of set the guidelines and set the standards of what's acceptable and what's not. So people in the organization will look to their leaders and what they do. They will regard that as, sample actions for what they should do themselves. And I mentioned already about culture. It can be enforced by culture, but also by formally written down procedures. The reward system we talked about before in terms of incentivizing behavior or leading to behavior. So you need to look at the reward system and see, does that support the ethical stance of the organization? Next point here mentions that every strategic action ought to be ethical. This really is resulting in the last number of years from various scandals that took place 10, 20 years ago. The Enron scandal, for example, being probably the most well known, but there have been a number of banking and other scandals as well that have essentially brought down the reputation of business. And the view now in business schools is that decisions ought to be ethical. That word ought is very much an ethical or moral word. It's what we should do. So when you see ought and should, you're automatically thinking of moral values. The legal requirement is a minimum standard. In other words, just because you meet legal requirements doesn't mean it's morally or ethically acceptable, that particular action. For example, selling particular chemicals that are, say, banned in the Western world may be not banned in developing countries, and firms may sell them DDT or chemicals like that are banned here, may be sold elsewhere. It doesn't, just because they're legal elsewhere, it doesn't mean it's right to actually sell them elsewhere. That's a moral decision. You need to weigh that up. And the final point there is act firmly if breached. Again, leadership or the organization must set the standards, and if the standards are breached, this must be recognized and enforced, or sanctions must be enforced if the ethical standards are breached. That gives the message that ethics are important. So I'm going to look now for a few minutes at ethics to do with businesses themselves, and then to do with the individual, and then I'll provide a framework for ethical decision making. In terms of business, the first 3 points there: universalism, ethical relativism, and integrated social contracts. There are 3 broad brush approaches that businesses can take to their ethical stances, particularly multinational businesses that cross countries. So universalism essentially implies that the home country's ethical standards should prevail across all jurisdictions, across all countries that the organization operates in. So no exceptions. Ethical relativism takes the view that we actually do whatever, when in Rome, do what Romans do. You do what's appropriate or what's allowable or what's ethical or what's standard procedure in the country that you're working in. Even if it's not your home country's procedure, you adapt to local circumstances. But there are obviously issues with that, in the sense that if certain procedures or practices are acceptable locally, for bribery, for example, it might be commonplace that you you pass a purse to somebody to get a job done, that may not be acceptable in the home country. And in fact, the organization may take the view it's not acceptable at all. So therefore, ethical relativism has its issues. Universalism also has its issues in that it's imposing often a home country culture or ethical approach or ethical stance on all other nations, where it may not be appropriate. Integrated social contracts is, in a sense, a halfway house mechanism where certain principles are held across all countries. For example, the no bribery principle. That may be the case no matter what country you're operating in, even if bribery is normally accepted as a business practice. If your organization takes an integrated social contracts approach, it might just regard that as not acceptable anywhere. But other practices might be altered locally to meet local practices and local norms. So, for example, it may be appropriate to give a gift at Christmas, or it may not, depending on the local practice, and then also depending, obviously, on the size of the gift and so on. But you can tailor some aspects of the business or the business practices to the local circumstances, but certain elements are held strictly across the globe. In terms of the company ethical stance itself, I've just listed 4 here from the Thomson-Strickland text. And essentially here we're looking at either, starting at, say, short-term shareholder interest. That's all you're interested in as an organization. You don't look beyond the next quarter, and that shapes your thinking on most decisions. You may be a company that actually looks at the longer-term shareholder interests. Japanese companies tend to look much longer, at a much longer time horizon than US companies. So that's a second potential stance. You may regard, in fact, multiple stakeholders as of importance, not just shareholders. And we talked already that the Business Roundtable in the US is now looking at the importance of multiple stakeholders, not simply shareholder value. So that may be a way you're going forward. And then some companies actually view themselves as shapers of society. That's their mission is actually to shape or change society. And they take that from the beginning. The Body Shop had that view at the beginning, that it was a different kind of a company doing different kinds of things. And lots of organizations have that view. They regard themselves as shapers of society. So they're taking a strong ethical stance from the outset. So they're just 4 broad approaches. In terms of how to deal with issues as they arise, some firms take the unconcerned approach. In other words, the business of business is business. Ethics, so long as we obey the rules and what we do is legal and so on, we meet the industry requirements, that's all we need to consider. We don't really need to look at anything beyond that. Damage control is sort of a next step up the ethical standards ladder. That's really where you have certain standards. If you're caught out in something, you just deal with it, but they're minimal enough standards. Compliance is where you put in place a whole series of codes and policies and procedures, and essentially you hold to those. So that's quite a strong culture of ethical compliance. And then the final one that is mentioned here is ethical culture, where essentially it's where ethical behavior is deeply ingrained in everything the organization does. So that's kind of the top tier of the in terms of the ladder of ethical stances. And then the individual manager has a role, and we'll see this coming up in the framework, and we'll see it coming up in a few minutes again. So it's the individual manager who make decisions. We talked in decision making about how individuals make decisions. Organizations actually cannot make decisions. Only people can make decisions, although it's not quite as simple as that in an organization where multiple people are involved in the decision. But essentially, a person makes a decision. So the individual has the power to make decisions, and that individual can have conflicts of interest and all sorts of other issues that maybe are elements of that decision. So they must be taken into account, individual conflicts of interest. But essentially, the individual is responsible for their own action and their own decisions, and the individual must accept the consequences. And often the individual is held accountable, is held to account over those consequences, and can even be charged and jailed and so on, as we have many corporate examples of that. And ultimately, if the individual may have to move to the point of blowing a whistle if they can't find other ways out of it, whistleblowing maybe the only, in other words, going outside the organization, maybe the only option left to individuals. So that's a means of dealing with an ethical situation, but it's a pretty extreme means, and it involves going outside the organization to other outside agencies. In terms of individuals, then, as I mentioned, individuals have to make the decision, and individuals can have different stances and can bring different resources to bear on that decision. So we could always act in one's own self-interests. This is the Adam Smith, Milton Friedman type philosophy, coming from economics, but also other disciplines, where essentially it regards humans as acting as self-interested agents and act in their own interests, and that's the way things are. However, others argue that, in fact, well, it's not as simple as that. People often often consider others, but it may just be because that's also in their best interest. So a father might consider his family because it's in his interest to consider impact on his family members as well, because that'll come back on him eventually. But we'll see, final point there mentions that human beings are inherently concerned with others. So a father might just be naturally concerned about his family, nothing to do with his own self-interest, just that it's important to be concerned about others, family, friends, neighbours, and so on. And then the middle point there, we may base judgments on some form of value system that we've grown up with or we've learned as we've gone along. And they can be drawn from a number of places. I've mentioned two here. There are other sources. One is religious principles of some kind or other, in particular the Golden Rule, which tends to pervade most of the major religions. And that's do unto others as you would have them do unto you. So you don't want to do something to somebody else, make a decision that would impact on somebody else in a way that you wouldn't like that happening to yourself. So that's a kind of rule you can apply. Other rules are coming from the philosophers, particularly the moral philosophers. We have Aristotle's golden mean, where you look at various virtues or characteristics and you choose one that has a balance. Courage, for example, being a balance between, there was the determination to do something, but being a balance between fear of, avoiding things because of fearfulness, or say foolhardiness or riskiness, overly risky. So courage is a balance between doing things, between not doing things at all due to fear and carrying out overly risky actions. So that golden mean, or that balance, is very much part of Aristotle's philosophy. Jeremy Bentham's greatest good for the greatest number, this kind of utilitarian approach, is another alternative. So you're looking at the outcome, what's some kind of working out the value of the outcome of the decision, and if the outcome is a good one, then the decision is a good one. It's that sort of approach. You're looking at the outcome first. Kant looked at categorical, his concept of categorical imperative. So you can only do something if everyone else will also do it. In other words, certain things are right or correct to do or not do, and it doesn't matter what the outcome is. You do certain things because that's the way it is. It's categorical. It's definitive, and you're looking at the process or the way, the means, not so much at the outcome, which is, say, the utilitarian or Bentham's view. Pareto had the Pareto principle, to do something, if somebody gains out of it, but nobody else is harmed and nobody else loses out, that would be acceptable. So that's the heading towards the Pareto. That's Pareto's principle. And then Hobbes, another philosopher, had this concept of life is nasty, mean, solitary, mean, nasty, brutish, and short. And essentially, by definition, we require some kind of society. So it forces us to think of some society or some collective body or collective action. Otherwise, we end up in this war against all wars where life is pretty miserable. So they're, broadly speaking, elements that inform our individual ethical decision making. I've obviously covered a lot of ground there, and there's much to read on that. But just to show you that there are influences that bear on our decisions to do it ourselves. So we've looked at the organization and its stance. We've looked at ourselves and our stance. So now we're linking these two things to the subject strategy and the ethical dimension of the subject. And the main one here is that you can see on the left-hand side there, if there's pressure for performance from the top of the organization and the situation is such that the organization doesn't care too much how things are actually done, it can lead to unethical or illegal action on the part of those at the front line, those at the bottom of the organization, or those who have to carry out and make the decisions. So this notion of greed or overly demanding performance and a culture that supports that can lead to pressure and can lead to decisions that are questionable. So we have two examples here. Well, in fact, they're both related to the same organization. This is chairman of the Transportation Committee, quoted in Washington Post, to do with Boeing. It's not about one employee. It's about a failure of safety culture at Boeing, in which undue pressure is placed on employees to meet deadlines and ensure profitability at the expense of safety. And this is to do with the MAX, the Boeing 747 MAX, 737 MAX, two failures, two crashes, plane crashes as a result of, let's call it, poor processes, or as he mentions here, a failure of a safety culture. Up at the top of the screen, there's a Austin paper by Austin, and again he gives the Boeing example as well, and he's looking at, again, pressure for performance leading to unethical decisions that have an unethical aspect, and people may not always be aware of it. Badaracco at the bottom here, the two sections here at the bottom refer to research carried out by Badaracco on middle managers. And what he found was that, in fact, managers were essentially the imperatives that they adopted or were, found themselves adopting was to make your numbers and do what needs to be done, to be loyal to the team rather than question what the team is doing. Don't break the law. We saw that already, but we did mention legal requirements are a minimum, not a target. And then a general sense of no need to overemphasize ethics in the organization. So this was as I say, a piece of research carried out on ethical behavior of middle managers. And essentially, the managers themselves found they were put under ethical pressure. So organizations, they ended up in this sandwich here. Senior executives being out of touch with what's going on in the organization, particularly lower down the lines or towards the front line. The codes they found were not much use. So many organizations might have codes, but if the codes aren't enforced or aren't actually determining what's done, they're not much use. And their approach was largely to draw on their own core values, which we mentioned some of those a couple of minutes ago. And the sleep test, in other words, if you can't sleep, if it's nagging at you, if you're feeling guilty about it, there's probably something questionable in your decision, and you may need to look at that. So the sleep test is one to remember. Another example here again, Wells Fargo. This is an ethical breach that led to fines that cost the firm $1 billion. So, it's worth complying with ethical standards just purely from a financial point of view, because the financial implications can be very serious. That's not to say that's the major reason or the only reason you should, but that is a reason in its own right. And they talked about repeated violations at Wells Fargo, and what could alter the stakes are changes in corporate culture. So the changes at organizational level, and then the prospect of criminal liabilities on banks and their executives. So again, this would force a change at individual level. So organization and individual, the two levels need to be co-involved in a move forward in terms of ethical decisions. And then finally, I'll end up with this framework for ethical decision making. This is from Fraedrich and Ferrell. Their text on business ethics. So they have a whole textbook out on business ethics. If you want to read more about this, I'd recommend going to that particular book. And this is just a very quick summary of much of what they're saying in that book in terms of the decision-making aspect of ethics. And they essentially give this simple framework, 3 major antecedents of the decision or the intention to make a decision. And they talk about the intensity, the ethical intensity of the issue. And that is, essentially not all issues demand a huge response, but some do. So it might depend on the importance of the decision as you perceive it. So, for example, the tea bag that you use in your tea at your tea break may not be a hugely ethical decision for many people, or maybe it is for some. But if you're a tea company, the choice of tea could well be an ethical decision because it's of major importance. So you can't fight all battles, but some certain major ones require you to consider the ethical dimensions. The moral intensity, in other words, the various spheres of influence that are impinging on you, whether it's family, workplace, religion, profession, your education, or the legal system itself. These different elements out there in society impinge on you in your decision making. And if there's a great deal of intensity from one or more of these spheres of influence, that makes the issue more intense for you. And generally, the perception of social pressure or social harms might make the decision more intense. Then there are individuals. So this is to do with the decision area itself. Second factor is to do with the individual. So again, these spheres of influence are all affecting that, and the various different ethical approaches that we talked about in the previous slide would also impact on that, religious and various philosophical stances and so on, as also do age, gender, education, nationality. Although you can read in Fraedrich and Ferrell that it's not clear. These do impact on ethical decision making, but there's no clear guidance on exactly how as of yet. And then finally, there's organizational factors. We talked about the organizational culture, significant others in the organization. So it might be the leaders of the organization, or it might be a leader in your particular business unit, or just influential people in your work, or indeed outside work, that may impact on the decision you finally make. The level of obedience to authority, if that's a general factor, that people just obey or do what they're told essentially without question, that's an organizational factor that might lead to a particular type of decision. And the final one is opportunity, the fourth factor. And that's really to do with the conditions that limit or permit ethical or unethical behavior. If everything is really pinned down with procedures and policies and so on, there may be very little opportunity anyway to make a decision that's not in line with the organization's view, and assuming the organization has an positive ethical stance, very little room to maneuver there. But other organizations are fairly lax and leave a lot of discretion to individuals, and therefore there can be quite a deal of opportunity in terms of expenses, in terms of stationery, taking home a pen or pencil or a post-it stamp or post-it pad and so on. All of these things can impinge on the decision you make. So then there's the issue of the evaluation and the intention to make a decision or to take ethical dimensions into account, and then there's the actual behavior itself. And they give some guidance here, which falls in line with what we've already said, but I'll just briefly summarize it. There's no substitute for critical thinking. It's worth thinking out the situation, looking at these factors. No one can tell you what is the right thing to do. It often comes down to often our individual beliefs conditioned by the organizational culture. Individuals responsible for their decision. We've talked about that already. And when the action is at odds with your values, that's when you might feel guilty about your decision. That's when you might fail the sleep test. And that's where you may need to reevaluate what's going on. And that could lead to either altering your views to fit with the decision situation. In other words, you're unhappy with it, but you alter your views to accommodate it, or you hold to your views, and the next time that decision situation comes up again, you may choose to make a different decision. And then final point is about ethical dilemmas, and this is really where things get very difficult. Problem-solving situations in which the decision rules are vague, so it's hard to find a guidance, or where they're in conflict, in which case you're going to have to break one or other. And what do you do in that particular situation? So you will, or you can get yourself involved in an ethical dilemma where there is no easy way out. And no matter what you do, you may feel somewhat guilty about your particular decision, but you may still have to live with it. All right. We're going to finish at that. So thank you for listening.